You're fired. Clean out your locker by 5. Sir, can I at least ask why? Why? Because you're the janitor we let play with computers. The real credentials are walking through that door Monday. You're just the thing we clear out to make room.
Behind Richard, the whole operations floor had gone silent. 40 people staring at their screens, pretending they couldn't hear a man getting erased in front of them. Malcolm didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He glanced once at the wall of monitors behind Richard's head. 14,000 packages moving across the country in real time, every route holding clean, and then he picked up his lunchbox and walked out the front doors of Vantage Dynamics on a Thursday afternoon in March. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said goodbye. That's how it works when they decide you were never really there. But in 41 days, the man Richard Voss called a janitor would be the only person alive who could save this company. And Richard would have to go to his front door and beg. Have you ever watched a man walk back into the building that threw him away and make every suit in the room go silent? Because you're about to. So drop a comment, hit that like, and let me take you back to where it all started. Here's what Richard Voss didn't know. That system on the monitors, the invisible thing moving 14,000 packages a day without a single human touching it, the backbone the entire company was built on top of. Malcolm Reed built that alone. On night shifts, with discarded servers and code he taught himself from library books, back when nobody was watching and nobody thought to ask. His title said Facilities Systems Technician, the man who reset the routers and fixed the broken conveyor sensors. That was the version of Malcolm they chose to see. Malcolm drove the 20 minutes home with the radio off. He'd rehearsed 100 versions of what he'd say, but when he opened the door and his daughter came running, all of it fell out of his head. "Daddy, you're early." Grace, 9 years old, gap in her front teeth, a math worksheet still clutched in one hand. She could do long division faster than the calculator on his phone, and she drew towers and bridges from memory after seeing them once. His whole world, standing in the hallway in mismatched socks. Malcolm knelt down. He didn't have the words for what happened today, so he found different ones. "Daddy's just going to have a little more time with you now," he said. "That's all." Grace studied his face the way she studied everything, close and careful. "Is that a good thing?" He made himself smile. "Yeah, baby, it's a good thing." That night, after she was asleep, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills. Rent in 12 days. Grace's after-school program. The specialist appointment he'd been putting money aside for, the one he still hadn't told her about. His savings could carry them 6 weeks, maybe 5. The faucet dripped into the sink behind him. He'd been meaning to fix it for a month. 41 days. That was the distance between this kitchen and everything changing. Malcolm didn't know that yet. But you do. Malcolm Reed learned to see patterns before he learned to drive. He grew up in a third-floor apartment where the elevator never worked and the mail came whenever it felt like coming. His mother cleaned offices downtown on the overnight shift. She'd come home at 6 in the morning, feet swollen, and Malcolm would already have breakfast made, because at 10 years old he'd figured out the exact minute the bus turned onto their street from the sound it made 3 blocks away. "You always know," she'd tell him, half asleep at the table. "How do you always know when I'm coming?" "The bus tells me," he'd say. She never understood what he meant. He couldn't explain it either. He just knew that everything moving in the world left a trail, and if you paid attention, the trail told you what came next. He didn't go to college. There was no money and no time, and no one in that apartment building who'd ever been. So Malcolm taught himself. Library computers. Discarded manuals. Online forums at 2 in the morning on a phone with a cracked screen. He learned how networks moved, how systems talked to each other, how 1,000 small decisions could be coordinated by one invisible hand if you built the hand right. He came to Vantage Dynamics at 26 for a maintenance job. High school diploma, willing to work early shifts, both true. Back then, Vantage was drowning. Deliveries ran days late. Trucks left half empty while packages piled up in the wrong warehouses. The founder, an old man named Arthur Bell, used to walk the floor at night because he couldn't sleep. And one of those nights he found Malcolm at a dead terminal, surrounded by paper, running numbers by hand. "What are you doing, son?" "Fixing your routing problem," Malcolm said, not looking up. "It's not a truck problem. It's a timing problem. You're sending everything out on the same schedule. If you stagger it by region, by weight, by distance, you clear the backlog in a week." Arthur Bell stood there a long time. Then he handed Malcolm the keys to the server room and told him nobody had to know. That was the arrangement. Corporate would never have approved a maintenance tech touching core systems. So Malcolm built it in the dark over 3 years, on nights and weekends, and he never put his name on any of it. Arthur told him to. Malcolm always said the same thing. The system works. That's what matters. The system worked. Vantage went from bleeding money to leading the region. Trade magazines called it a logistics miracle. They interviewed the executives. Nobody ever interviewed the man in the maintenance uniform who'd built the miracle in a room nobody visited. Arthur Bell retired 2 years ago. And the day Arthur walked out, the only person left at Vantage who knew the truth about Malcolm Reed walked out with him. The blueprints stayed in a locked archive. Malcolm's name was on none of them. Nobody had ever thought to ask. Richard Voss arrived like weather. He came from a private equity firm that had bought a controlling stake in Vantage, and he had a philosophy he repeated in every meeting until it stopped sounding like words. Credentials are the only signal that scales. What he meant was simpler than that. He meant that a man's worth could be read off his resume, and anyone whose resume was thin had told you exactly what they were. In his first month, he cut 14 people. He called it right-sizing the legacy layer. Most of them had been at Vantage more than 5 years. Most of them looked like Malcolm. Richard never said a word about that, and he never had to. The vocabulary did the work for him. Modernizing, upgrading the talent pipeline, aligning with industry benchmarks. Clean words for a dirty math anyone could do if they counted who was left. Then Richard brought in Evan Sterling. Evan was 29. An elite university, a fistful of patents, a way of speaking that assumed the room already agreed with him. He'd never run a distribution network in his life, but he'd published papers about them, and to Richard that was better than experience. Experience was what people had when they didn't have credentials. Evan looked at Vantage's control system the way a tourist looks at an old city. Impressed, a little, but mostly certain he could improve it. "This architecture is ancient," he told Richard in the first week. "It's held together with custom code nobody documented. No standards, no framework, no clean handoff. Whoever built this built a liability." "Whoever built this was maintenance staff," Richard said. "So that tracks." Malcolm was in the room when Evan proposed his first change. A rework of the timing protocol, the staggered scheduling logic, the exact thing Malcolm had built to keep the whole network from colliding with itself. "That timing logic isn't arbitrary," Malcolm said quietly. "Every window is calculated against the others. If you standardize it, you'll get collisions you won't see coming for weeks." The room turned to look at him. Evan smiled the way you smile at a child. "And your engineering background is?" Malcolm didn't answer. Richard did. "He doesn't have one. That's the point." Richard turned to the room. "This is exactly the mindset we're leaving behind. A man who can't tell you why something works, defending it because he's scared of change." He looked back at Malcolm. "We'll take it from here." 3 days later, Malcolm was fired. The first sign was so small nobody flagged it. A shipment bound for Denver arrived in Salt Lake City. One package. "A rounding error," someone said. "The kind of thing that happens." Evan's team corrected it by hand and moved on. Then it was 40 packages. Then 400. The standardized timing Evan had installed did exactly what Malcolm said it would do. It sent trucks into the same windows, and the windows began to overlap, and the overlaps began to cascade. A warehouse in Ohio started receiving inventory meant for 3 different states. The automated sorters, following instructions that no longer matched reality, sent packages confidently to the wrong coasts. Evan patched it. Every patch assumed the system was broken in a normal way, and the system was not broken in a normal way. It was doing precisely what he'd told it to do. Each fix pushed the collision somewhere new, and the somewhere new was always worse. By day 16, delivery times had doubled. Client complaints stopped coming in one at a time and started coming in by the hour. The stock dipped, then slid. By day 24, Vantage's largest customer, a national retailer worth $80 million a year, sent a formal notice. Fix this in 2 weeks or we invoke the exit clause. Richard called Evan into his office and shut the door. You told me this was a modernization, Richard said. It's a collapse. It's a transition artifact, Evan said, and even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. The old code has dependencies we haven't mapped. Whoever built it didn't document anything. It's like trying to fix a language nobody wrote a dictionary for. Then find the man who speaks it. Evan's jaw tightened. I've had 3 outside firms in here. None of them can read this architecture. It doesn't match anything they've studied. It's like it was built from scratch by someone who invented his own rules. Richard stared at him. Somewhere under all that credential, a cold thought was beginning to form. He just didn't want to say it yet. It was an old operations manager named Dolores Kemp who finally said the name. She'd been at Vantage 19 years. She'd survived Richard's cuts by keeping her head down and her opinions to herself, and she'd watched the whole thing fall apart with the specific grief of someone who'd seen it coming and hadn't been allowed to speak. In the emergency meeting, with the board on the line and the stock down 30%, she raised her hand. Where's Malcolm? Richard looked at her. Who? Malcolm Reed, the technician you let go. She kept her voice flat. He built the system you're trying to fix. The room went quiet. Richard almost laughed, then didn't, because nobody else was laughing. He was maintenance. His title was maintenance, Dolores said. That's a different sentence than the one you think you're saying. She walked to the archive herself. She had the key because nobody had ever thought to take it from her. And she came back with a box. And in the box were Malcolm's original design documents, handwritten diagrams, testing logs going back 7 years, timing calculations worked out by hand across dozens of pages, in a careful, patient script. Richard looked at the pages the way you look at a language you're only now realizing you should have learned. And underneath the diagrams was something else, something worse. A single folder, labeled in Malcolm's handwriting. A second architecture. A backup network built to sit dormant beneath the primary one, designed to take over automatically if the main system ever failed catastrophically. A dead man's switch for a company that hadn't known it was standing on one. Evan found it in the code that afternoon, dormant, waiting, wired into everything. He could see that it existed. He could see it was the way out. He could not turn it on. It required a launch sequence that lived nowhere in the system. It lived in one place. It lived in Malcolm's head. Richard Voss drove to Malcolm's neighborhood himself. He didn't send an email. The board wouldn't let him. Dolores had made it a condition, and the board, terrified now, had agreed. If you want him, you ask him. In person. Like a human being. Malcolm was on his knees in a neighbor's kitchen with a washing machine motor, in pieces on a towel when the knock came. Grace answered the door and looked up at the man in the expensive coat. Dad, she called. There's a fancy man here. Malcolm came to the door wiping his hands. When he saw who it was, nothing moved in his face. Mr. Reed, Richard said. The words seemed to cost him something. The system's failing. We need you back. Malcolm looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Back as what? Richard opened his mouth and found he didn't have an answer ready. 6 weeks ago, this man had been a janitor he let play with computers. Now the entire company was holding its breath in his doorway. Chief Systems Architect, Richard said finally. Whatever the title needs to be, name it. It's not about the title. Malcolm glanced back into the apartment where Grace had gone back to her homework at the kitchen table, then out at the man who'd erased him in front of 40 people. I have conditions. You're going to want to write them down. The conditions were not what Richard expected. I don't come through the service entrance, Malcolm said. I walk in the front. I don't work under Evan Sterling. And nobody in that building tells me what I'm doing wrong. Richard nodded. Done. I'm not finished. Malcolm's voice stayed even. Every worker you fired in your first month gets a call. Not an email, not a form letter. A phone call from you telling them the company was wrong. And any of them who wants their job back gets it back before I touch a single line of code. Richard's face did something complicated. Some of those people have moved on. Some of them won't come back. Then they'll have the choice you took from them, Malcolm said. That's the deal. All of it or none of it. I'll go back to my washing machines and you can explain to your board why you let $80 million walk out the door over a phone call you didn't want to make. There was a silence on the doorstep. In it, Richard Voss understood, maybe for the first time, that he was not the most powerful person in this conversation and hadn't been for a while. Fine, he said. All of it. The calls went out that night. Not all 14 came back. Some had built new lives and a few couldn't bring themselves to walk back through those doors because being thrown away leaves a mark that a phone call doesn't erase. But 6 of them came. Dolores called each of them herself after Richard did to make sure the words had meant something. And the next morning, Malcolm Reed walked in through the front doors of Vantage Dynamics. The command center was full when he arrived. The board, the engineers, Richard against the back wall. Evan Sterling beside the main console, exhausted, his certainty gone somewhere in the last 3 weeks. And on the enormous screen, the whole failing network, red alerts stacked on red alerts, $80 million unraveling in real time. Malcolm didn't go to the keyboard. He stood in front of the wall of data and he read it. The way he'd read the bus turning onto his street at 10 years old. The way he'd read Arthur Bell's backlog 15 years ago. He watched the timing overlaps bloom and collide, and he traced them backward to the moment they started. You changed the timing protocol, he said, not a question. Evan straightened. We standardized it. It was the only undocumented. You put every truck on the same clock. Malcolm finally looked at him. I staggered it on purpose. Every window was calculated against every other window. You took a system that breathed and you told it to hold its breath. Then you kept patching the symptoms and wondering why it kept choking. He walked to the console. There's nothing in the code that explains the stagger, Evan said, and there was something almost pleading in it now. I looked, for weeks. Where did the logic even live? Same place the backup lives, Malcolm said. Somewhere you don't have the credentials to look. He entered a sequence nobody in the room recognized. The screen went black. A murmur ran through the board. Then a second network bloomed into being, clean and dormant and perfect. And across the top of it ran 3 words. M. Reed Emergency Architecture. Richard stared. What is that? Malcolm looked back at him. The system you fired me without knowing you needed. He activated it. The recovery was not loud. That was the strange thing. Everyone in the room had braced for something dramatic, and instead the screen simply began to heal. The backup architecture woke and read the wreckage of the primary system in seconds. It saw the collisions Malcolm had predicted 6 weeks ago, the exact ones, and it began routing around them. Shipment paths corrected. Warehouse inventories, scattered across the wrong states, resolved back into order. Delivery windows rebuilt themselves one region at a time. The red alerts began going dark, not all at once, in sequence the way a fever breaks. The room watched a company come back to life under the hands of the man it had thrown away. And then Malcolm did the thing that turned the whole day over. He pulled up a record amped, logged, filed, and stamped across each one in the same corporate language every time. No action required. Outside submitter's scope. I sent these up the chain for 7 years, Malcolm said. His voice didn't rise. Every improvement, every safeguard, every warning about exactly what would happen if someone touched the timing. Your own office rejected them because my title wasn't allowed to submit engineering proposals. He scrolled. The dates climbed, the rejections repeated. The company used my work every single day, 14,000 packages a day. And every time I tried to put my name to it, someone in this building decided the name didn't qualify. He turned to the board. You didn't just fire the man who built your system. You spent 7 years pretending he didn't exist while you lived off what he built. Dolores Kemp set a printed folder on the table. Every rejection stamped by Richard's office and the offices before his. Then came the last piece, and it was the one that finished Evan. His modernization didn't improve anything, Malcolm said, nodding at the screen. Pull the changelog. Every safeguard I built into the timing system, the collision guards, the regional fail-safes, the throttles that kept the network from doing exactly this. He didn't upgrade them. The log came up. The room read it. He deleted them, Malcolm said. He called them clutter. He removed the exact things that were holding it all together. And then he blamed the code for being undocumented, when the truth is he threw away the documentation because it came from a man he decided wasn't real. Evan Sterling looked at the screen for a long time. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. His whole career had been built on the belief that credentials were the same thing as understanding, and he was standing in a room where that belief had just cost $80 million and been proven, line by line, to be a lie. The board removed Richard Voss the following week. The official motion said gross mismanagement. Everyone in the room knew the longer version, the one about a man who looked at Malcolm Reed and saw only what he wanted to see and nearly killed a company doing it. Evan Sterling resigned before they could ask him to. On his way out, he stopped where Malcolm was working, alone, restoring the safeguards line by line. I didn't know, Evan said, about any of it. Voss told me you were maintenance. He told me I was here to clean up legacy work. Malcolm didn't stop what he was doing. And you believed him because it was easier than looking. Evan had no answer to that. You're not a bad engineer, Malcolm said, and he meant it. You're just not a curious one. You walked into a system somebody built by hand, and you assumed your degree meant you already understood it. You never once asked who. He turned back to the screen. Next time somebody without your resume tells you something's about to break, do them one favor. Let them finish the sentence. Evan stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, to a man who wasn't looking at him, and walked out of Vantage Dynamics for the last time. The retailer didn't just renew the contract, they expanded it. The procurement director called the new leadership personally and said, "Whatever you did in there, keep doing it." Nobody had the heart to tell him the answer was simply that they'd stop throwing away the person who built it. 6 of the fired workers were back at their stations within the month. Dolores Kemp was moved into Richard's old office, and the first thing she did was take down the chrome and glass and hang a single photograph on the wall, the Day One operations team from 19 years ago. Most of them, people the last regime had tried to erase. Malcolm took the top job. Chief Systems Architect, full authority, compensation that finally matched the 15 years he'd given the place in the dark. He signed the offer on a Tuesday, and that afternoon his name went onto the blueprints, every page, where it should have been from the very beginning. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He just watched the archive update, one document at a time. Reed appearing in the corner of drawings that had carried no name for a decade and a half. Grace's test got scheduled the following week. Paid in full, no payment plan, no juggling. The tremor turned out to be something manageable, something with a name and a treatment and a doctor who wasn't in a hurry. Not the worst of the things Malcolm had lain awake imagining at that kitchen table. He cried in the parking lot after that appointment, alone for a long time, in a way he hadn't let himself since the day he was fired. A few months later, Grace visited her father at work for the first time. She stood at the mezzanine rail above the operations floor and looked at the enormous wall of screens, 14,000 packages moving clean across the country, every window holding, every route breathing the way Malcolm had built it to breathe. "Daddy," her eyes were huge. "You built all this?" Malcolm crouched down beside her, the way he had in the hallway on the worst afternoon of the year. "I built the first version," he said. She frowned, working it out the way she worked out everything. "The first version? What about now?" He took her hand, the right one, the one that used to shake, steady now in his. "Now," he said, "we're going to build something better." Below them, the system hummed, steady and invisible, doing exactly what it was made to do. And for the first time in 15 years, the name of the man who made it was written where anyone could look and see it. If you have enjoyed this story, do not forget to give us a like and subscribe for more great stories.